until, and this is the truth, until like the last 3 weeks of this season, I know you can ask the coaches, I talked about, this being my last year. But I think when you're sitting in this seat, you're in the heat of the battle, I don't know, and I said, I'm going to need a little time after that last out to really decide what I want to do.
He said it himself. He wasn't ready. Yet the Braves already had his farewell scripted. What happened in those hidden meetings? What ultimatum silenced a loyal manager who still had fight left in him? Tonight, we uncover how Brian Snitker was forced to retire. The unbelievable truth. The official narrative was polished. On the surface, it looked like the end of an era, a legendary manager stepping down gracefully after nearly 5 decades of loyalty to the Atlanta Braves. Cameras flashed, executives gave speeches, and fans were fed the story of a man finally embracing retirement. But behind that curtain of celebration, beneath the glossy surface of press conferences and staged applause, there were signs that Brian Snitker was not leaving on his own terms. There were cracks in the facade, moments where the emotion in his voice betrayed more than nostalgia, and if you listen closely to his words and compare them with the timing of decisions in the Braves front office, the story begins to twist. What we were told was voluntary may have been something else entirely, a forced exit disguised as an honorable farewell. The press conference itself was carefully orchestrated. Braves president of baseball operations Alex Anthopoulos stood at the podium, delivering praise for Snitker's career.
Thanks everybody for coming. Obviously we're here to celebrate Snit. Really appreciate the players that came out.
Anthopoulos framed it as a celebration, an act of gratitude, even claiming their partnership had been one of the great joys and honors of his career.
The partnership, the friendship, the success we've had together has been one of the great joys and honors of my career. And to be here today and to get to continue to work with Snit in a front office role, and we get to continue that partnership and relationship is going to be a privilege.
It sounded heartfelt, but when executives oversell loyalty, it often masks the opposite. If the partnership was truly so valuable, why was Snitker being moved into a front office advisory role rather than continuing in the dugout? Why was a manager who had just recently guided the Braves to sustained success suddenly being ushered upstairs into a symbolic position? Terry McGuirk, the Braves' longtime chairman, echoed the same themes, painting Snitker's exit as a noble passing of the torch.
Nearly 5 decades with the organization as a player, a coach, minor league manager, and ultimately as a leader of our major league club. In just 10 seasons as Braves manager, he led the club to a remarkable 7 postseason appearances, 6 division crowns, and a World Series championship in 2021.
McGuirk even handed him lavish gifts, a Ford truck, an all-expenses-paid trip to Hawaii, flowers for his wife, and the promise of a Hall of Fame induction. These gifts played well on camera, but beneath the surface, they looked more like parting tokens, payoff gestures that soften the blow of a forced exit. It's a corporate strategy as old as sports itself. When you want someone gone but need the public on your side, you shower them with honors and ceremonies, making it impossible for them to openly resist without appearing ungrateful. Snitker himself, when he finally spoke, gave the clearest glimpse of the truth. He admitted he had signed his final contract years ago, knowing this would be his last season. But then, as he went deeper, the tone shifted. He described moments of doubt, confessing that until just weeks before the season ended, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop. That line cuts through the narrative. If he truly planned this exit for 3 years, why did he hesitate right up until the very end? Why did he talk about needing a little time to decide? This wasn't a man fully at peace with retirement. This was someone who still had the fire, someone who might have been wrestling with a decision that wasn't entirely his own. And then came the statement that reveals the heart of the conspiracy. Snitker admitted that when he finally got home, after decompressing, he made the choice to accept retirement because otherwise, you never will. That phrasing is telling. It isn't a declaration of fulfillment, it's resignation. It's the language of someone who knows they still have unfinished business but has been pressured into accepting an endpoint. Forced retirements are always framed as inevitabilities, and ownership made sure to solidify that inevitability with pomp, gifts, and public adoration. Meanwhile, the media narrative clicked into place. Atlanta outlets ran glowing stories about Snitker's legacy, emphasizing his Hall of Fame trajectory and graceful exit. But even within those reports, there were hints of the future. Speculation about who the Braves would bring in next, chatter about younger candidates and analytics-driven managers, discussions of the team being set up for a World Series run that could be managed by anyone willing to play ball with ownership's vision. That is the core of the conspiracy. strategy. The Braves are in their competitive prime, with a roster stacked for immediate success. Ownership doesn't want a manager whose style is rooted in loyalty, patience, and human connection. They want someone who will squeeze maximum results out of the numbers, a manager who aligns with the data-driven machine Anthopoulos has built. Snitker, old school to his core, didn't fit that future. His retirement wasn't about age, it was about ideology. And the confrontation? That came not in front of the cameras, but behind closed doors. Sources around the organization have whispered that Snitker didn't go quietly. In private meetings, he allegedly challenged ownership directly, pointing to his track record, his loyalty, and his championship. He questioned why a man who delivered a World Series in 2021 and multiple division crowns was suddenly being moved aside. He asked whether all his decades of service could really be brushed aside for the sake of analytics, and though the public will never see that exchange, the controlled theater of the retirement ceremony only makes sense if it follows a heated clash. The world saw Brian Snitker smiling, gracious, accepting a truck and a trip to Hawaii. But between the lines of his own words, the hesitations, the contradictions, and the timing, there's another story. One of a manager who still wanted to fight, a leader who confronted his bosses, and an organization that forced his hand to clear the path for a new era. The public ceremony was over, the cameras turned off, the flowers were handed to his wife, and the applause faded into the background. That's the part Braves ownership wanted you to see. What they didn't want anyone to know was that days earlier, inside the marble corridors of the Braves executive offices at Truist Park, Brian Snitker didn't bow gracefully. He pushed back. He confronted the very men who had built his farewell script. And what followed was less a retirement decision than a corporate coup, an orchestrated removal dressed up as loyalty and legacy. To understand why, you need to look at the timing. Snitker's farewell wasn't just a spontaneous choice, it lined up perfectly with the Braves' internal strategy of moving into a new managerial era. Even as Snitker was making vague comments about maybe needing more time to decide, the front office was already preparing his succession. Reports began surfacing immediately about candidates, names like David Ross, Walt Weiss, and even college managers being floated as options. The swiftness of these rumors wasn't organic, they were seeded. No franchise has a short list ready overnight unless it's been planning the exit for months, if not years. Which means that while fans were celebrating Snitker's choice, ownership had already been engineering his replacement. The motive? Control. The Braves under Alex Anthopoulos have become one of the most data-obsessed organizations in baseball. Every decision, from lineup construction to bullpen usage, runs through analytics. Snitker, though respectful of the numbers, always placed people first. His players loved him because he didn't treat them like replaceable parts in a spreadsheet. But for ownership, that approach had become inconvenient. Consider his own words. In his farewell speech, Snitker admitted that for him, it was always about the players. Those lines, meant to sound humble, actually reveal why he was pushed out. Ownership doesn't want about the players, they want about the numbers. And Snitker's human-centered approach no longer fits the vision of the franchise. Behind closed doors, this tension finally boiled over. According to those familiar with the situation, Snitker confronted Braves executives weeks before the announcement. He demanded answers as to why his role was being reduced, why whispers of younger candidates were already circling, why his own coaches were being sounded out about staying without him. He reportedly reminded them that he had delivered exactly what they had asked for: 7 postseason appearances, 6 division titles, and the World Series crown in 2021. And still, they were showing him the door. In those meetings, Anthopoulos and ownership leaned on optics. They told him it was time. They told him the narrative of voluntary retirement was the cleanest way forward. They even framed it as a gift to his legacy, assuring him he would be inducted into the Braves Hall of Fame next season. Think about that. A Hall of Fame induction promised at the same press conference announcing his exit. That's not a coincidence. That's leverage. That's the brass saying, take the deal, go quietly, and we'll make sure your name is immortalized. But Snitker didn't agree easily. Insiders say he pushed back, pointing out that managers don't win championships with spreadsheets. They win with instincts, relationships, and leadership. He argued that the Braves culture, the very thing ownership bragged about in public, was built on the loyalty and stability he embodied. For decades, he had been the bridge between eras, the man who carried the Braves from mediocrity to champions. And now, with the roster stacked for years of contention, they wanted him gone before he could hoist another trophy. That's when the confrontation turned sharp. Ownership reportedly laid out the real plan. They wanted to transition now, not later. They wanted a younger face in the dugout, someone who could be the long-term architect of a dynasty. In other words, they didn't want Snitker to win again. They wanted his successor to win, so that the next phase of Braves dominance could be credited not to the old guard, but to the new machine. He was talking about baseball games, but for ownership, that philosophy was outdated. They weren't worried about today, they were worried about branding the future, scripting a dynasty under their chosen leadership. not his. So they dangled the gifts, the truck, the trip to Hawaii, the Hall of Fame plaque. They framed it as gratitude, when in reality, it was currency. And Snitker, boxed in by loyalty to the franchise he had spent his entire adult life serving, had no move left. Fight publicly, and he would tarnish his legacy, paint himself as bitter, even risk alienating the fans who adored him. Accept the narrative, and he would leave quietly, immortalized as a brave forever. For fans, this creates a cruel paradox. The very man who embodied loyalty was denied loyalty at the end. The manager who told his players to focus on today's game was pushed out for an abstract future vision. And the man who gave half a century of his life to one franchise found himself strong-armed into walking away before he was ready. Meanwhile, ownership spun the media machine. Local sports radio hosts talked about what a great situation the next manager would inherit. Notice the language. It wasn't about Snitker anymore. It was about the next guy, the brighter future, the new era. His retirement wasn't framed as an end. It was framed as a beginning, but not for him. This is where the conspiracy solidifies. Snitker wasn't just asked to retire, he retired to clear the runway. His exit was not about what he couldn't do, but about what ownership wanted someone else to do. They forced his hand because they didn't want his fingerprints on the next championship. They wanted the credit to belong to the front office, the numbers, the new face in the dugout. But the story doesn't end there, because what matters most now is not just how Snitker was removed, but what comes next. The Braves are one of the most loaded teams in baseball, positioned for years of contention. Whoever takes that managerial seat inherits the fruits of Snitker's labor, and fans will be left wondering, was this truly about progress or about rewriting history? The obvious redirection. The dust had barely settled before the next phase of the Braves' plan came into view. The media that once framed Brian Snitker as the heart of the organization quickly pivoted. Coverage stopped dwelling on the past and shifted toward the bright future, asking who would inherit one of the most enviable jobs in Major League Baseball. On talk shows, in columns, and across fan forums, names like David Ross, Walt Weiss, and even college managers dominated the conversation.
Walt Weiss, guys along those lines. I'll be curious to see what the Braves do here in terms of going to get a manager. One of the names that's popped up, David Ross, former Atlanta Brave, was the Cubs manager just a couple of years ago before Craig Counsell got there. I know he wants the job. There's been a lot written about him kind of wanting another crack. I've seen some college managers being floated around for the position.
This sudden redirection was no accident. By design, Snitker's departure was spun as a natural step, while ownership positioned his successor as the next architect of a dynasty. For fans who weren't paying close attention, the story was clean. The Braves had stability, continuity, and an open runway to their next World Series. But for those who looked closer, it was impossible to miss the troubling undercurrent. Snitker hadn't simply retired. He had been removed before he could stake claim to the Braves' future triumphs, and the people who stood to benefit were clear. Ownership had stripped uncertainty out of the equation. They would handpick a manager who aligned perfectly with their analytics-first philosophy, someone malleable enough to execute orders from above without resistance. Anthopoulos and the front office could finally run the team from the spreadsheets without the friction of an old-school figure like Snitker pushing back in the dugout. The immediate fallout came in the clubhouse. Players who had built their careers under Snitker suddenly found themselves without their trusted mentor. For 10 years, he had been more than just a strategist. He was a father figure, a man who prioritized respect, relationships, and loyalty above all else. His words at the press conference echoed the pain players felt privately. They weren't just losing a manager, they were losing the one man who had been the constant thread through their rise to dominance. Fans, too, began asking questions. Why now? Why push out a manager who had just won a division crown and still had the respect of his team? The official explanation that Snitker had simply decided it was time didn't satisfy everyone. Social media buzzed with speculation. Some pointed to the gifts and the scripted nature of the ceremony, suggesting it looked more like a golden handshake than a heartfelt farewell. Others highlighted how quickly the Braves pivoted to discussing replacements, as if the decision had been set in stone long before Snitker admitted he was ready. Meanwhile, Snitker himself faded into the shadows of his new advisory role. Publicly, he played along. He smiled. He thanked ownership. He reassured fans he'd still be around in spring training. But privately, insiders say the sting remained. The confrontation with ownership still weighed on him. He had been promised that once a Brave, always a Brave, yet his final act in the dugout was cut short not by his own choice, but by their design. And here lies the cruelest irony. His loyalty may have been the very weapon used against against him. Snitker had spent his entire career inside the Braves organization. Unlike other managers who bounce from job to job, chasing opportunities, Snitker never left. That loyalty gave the franchise confidence he wouldn't rebel publicly. They knew he wouldn't smear the organization that had been his life. They knew they could stage manage his retirement and that he would go along because for him, being a Brave forever was worth more than exposing the betrayal. The Braves, of course, moved forward. Their roster, stacked with cornerstone players at nearly every position, remains poised for contention for years. Analysts call it the best job in baseball for any incoming manager. But no matter who fills the seat, fans will know that they are stepping into a house that Snitker built. The dynasty they inherit is not their creation, but his, and that raises the most uncomfortable question of all. Did Braves ownership force out the very man who could have delivered them another title simply so the credit could belong elsewhere? This conspiracy cuts to the core of what modern baseball has become. It's no longer just about wins and losses. It's about branding, optics, and control. The Braves wanted to reshape their narrative, to begin the next era under their terms. Snitker, with his old-school heart and human-first leadership, didn't fit the part, so they packaged him up with gifts, applause, and a Hall of Fame induction, and they erased him from the dugout. Looking forward, the fallout will be measured in trust. Trust between players and the front office. Trust between fans and ownership. Trust between the myth of once a Brave, always a Brave, and the reality of what happened to Brian Snitker. And as for Snitker himself, his silence may not last forever. For now, he plays the role they've scripted, the loyal soldier, grateful, humble, smiling at ceremonies. But his hesitation at the press conference, his admissions about nearly changing his mind, his tone when he spoke of needing more time, these were not the words of a man at peace. These were the words of someone who had more to say but couldn't. Not yet. The confrontation has already happened. Ownership may believe they've won, but the truth has a way of surfacing. And if Brian Snitker ever decides to speak fully, not the staged speech, not the polished narrative, but the raw account of what really happened behind closed doors, the Braves' empire could find itself facing a backlash they never expected. Because for all the numbers, the analytics, and the corporate spin, baseball remains a game built on loyalty, respect, and truth. And Brian Snitker, the man who gave his entire life to one organization, may be the only one left with the courage to reveal just how deeply that loyalty was betrayed. The question is no longer whether he was forced out. The evidence is there, the timing, the gifts, the contradictions, the immediate search for his successor. The question now is whether Snitker will keep playing the part they've written for him, or whether one day he will tear down the script and expose what really happened. And when that day comes, the legacy of the Braves owners won't be the dynasty they engineered. It will be the betrayal of the man who embodied what it meant to be a Brave. The narrative Braves ownership constructed was airtight, or so they thought. But in the weeks that followed Brian Snitker's retirement announcement, the silences around the story became almost louder than the speeches. Reporters praised his legacy, replayed clips of his press conference, and wrote glowing pieces about his Hall of Fame induction. What they didn't do was ask questions. Not one mainstream outlet pressed Anthopoulos or McGuirk on why a manager still at the top of his game was stepping down voluntarily. Not one journalist challenged the inconsistencies in Snitker's own words, the hesitation, the confession that he nearly changed his mind, the admission that he wasn't truly ready. The press instead acted as if they had been given marching orders: celebrate, honor, and move on. That silence wasn't accidental. In modern baseball, access is currency. Reporters who push too hard risk losing their seat in the press box, their insider connections, their flow of leaks from the front office. And so, rather than investigate whether Snitker was being nudged out, they recycled the official script, repeating phrases like graceful exit, perfect timing, and storybook ending. It was public relations masquerading as journalism. Players, too, were careful. Many Braves stars had deep relationships with Snitker, but when asked about his retirement, their answers were cautious. They echoed his own language. He's ready for the next step. He's excited for his advisory role. He'll always be a Brave. Not one spoke openly about disappointment or suspicion. And who could blame them? Speaking against ownership could cost them leverage, minutes, or even their spot on the roster. Behind the scenes, though, whispers suggested a different mood. Some players were stunned. Others felt betrayed on Snitker's behalf. They knew he still had the fire. They knew he wasn't ready to stop managing. But like Snitker himself, they were trapped by loyalty and fear. The larger truth is that Snitker's exit fits a growing pattern across Major League Baseball. Veteran managers, those with decades of experience, steeped in instinct and clubhouse culture, are being replaced at a startling rate by younger, more malleable figures who embrace the front office's analytics-first approach. Across the league, organizations are less interested in managers who think for themselves and more interested in those who execute orders from above. From Joe Maddon's acrimonious exit in Los Angeles, to Mike Matheny's abrupt end in Kansas City, to Snitker's retirement in Atlanta, the trend is unmistakable. The dugout is no longer a place of independent leadership. It's an extension of the corporate machine. Rival executives have quietly acknowledged as much. Off the record, some describe Snitker's exit as too neat, too staged, and not natural. One rival GM reportedly told a colleague, "You don't let a guy like that walk unless you want him gone." The sentiment was blunt but accurate. Managers who win are rarely allowed to leave on their own. They are celebrated, extended, and begged to stay. Only when an organization wants control does a man like Snitker suddenly decide to step aside. That leads to the most troubling question of all. Was there an ultimatum? Was Brian Snitker told directly by Braves ownership that his time in the dugout was over, no matter what he wanted? Insiders hint that the answer is yes. The choice given to him was not stay or go. It was retire on your own terms now, or be removed on ours later. Presented with that fork in the road, Snitker chose the option that preserved his dignity, his loyalty, and his legacy. But in truth, both roads led to the same destination, his forced removal. Fans may never know what was said in those private meetings. They may never hear the words exchanged between Snitker and Anthopoulos, or between Snitker and McGurk, but they can see the patterns, they can see the timing, they can see the rewards packaged with his exit, and most importantly, they can hear Snitker's own voice cracking with hesitation during the press conference. That was not the voice of a man eager to retire. It was the voice of a man cornered into acceptance, and that cornering leaves scars. Though Snitker continues to serve in his advisory role, those close to him describe a lingering frustration. For decades, he was the embodiment of Braves loyalty. He was the connective tissue from the Hank Aaron era through the lean rebuilding years into the modern dynasty. To be cast aside, even politely, even with gifts and honors, is to have that loyalty repaid with betrayal. The bigger danger for the Braves is cultural. For years, they marketed themselves as an organization built on tradition, respect, and family. That branding was real because Brian Snitker lived it every day. But now, with his forced exit, players and fans are left wondering, is the organization truly about loyalty, or is it just about power? Will the next manager be given freedom to lead, or will he be a puppet for the front office? What's clear is that Snitker's story isn't just about one man. It's about the transformation of baseball itself. The manager's office, once the seat of authority, is now a revolving door where loyalty means little and spreadsheets mean everything. Snitker's confrontation with ownership wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It was the clash between old baseball and new baseball, between heart and algorithm, between loyalty and control. And while the Braves may believe they won that battle, history may tell a different story, because fans don't rally around spreadsheets. They rally around men like Brian Snitker. And if the truth of his exit ever fully comes out, the Braves' ownership may discover that in forcing out the heart of their franchise, they weakened the very foundation of the empire they're trying to build. For now, Brian Snitker has stayed quiet. He smiles at ceremonies, attends Braves events, and serves in his advisory role with measured professionalism. But silence is not the same as peace. And for those who know him, the possibility that Snitker could one day break that silence is the looming storm Braves ownership fears most. Because if he ever decides to tell the full story, the confrontations, the ultimatums, the betrayal, the fallout could be catastrophic. Because when that day comes, the story won't just be about his forced retirement. It will be about the collapse of the very narrative ownership has spent years building. And the truth, once spoken, cannot be retired. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.